All right. This week, I'm going to hit you with a thing that no parent wants to hear. Your children aren't just experiencing all of those parenting techniques you're trying to be consistent with day after day as you try to raise good human beings. They're actually experiencing something much more powerful that underpins everything you do: your relationship with yourself. Because long before our children adopt our rules and routines, they experience the way we relate to ourselves. And nothing exposes our relationship with ourselves faster than parenting. And the truth is, whether we realize it or not, kids feel the energy we bring to every interaction long before we verbalize anything. And that energy is louder than any of the words we say, even when we're yelling. So it's something we need to have in check if we want to get our message across. So, no pressure. But don't worry, if you're listening to or reading this, that's actually proof that you're invested in becoming the best version of yourself for the children you've been entrusted with. And you're in the right place, because here's where we address the root of what's actually driving your behavior versus just the behavior itself, which is actually a symptom, but also a powerful indicator of something deeper: your perception. So that's what we're going to dig into today. And even if you aren't a parent, stay with me, because the principles we'll discuss here apply to anyone responsible for influencing, guiding, teaching, or caring for others, regardless of their age. So hello, and welcome to Powered by Purpose. I'm Melody Lacey, and I help people clear the distorted perceptions that keep us from being able to see and treat ourselves and others the way God asks us to. And that includes our kids. Because the struggle is real. Most of us are struggling to some degree with a tension that's keeping us emotionally reactive and disconnected from how God's called us to steward our influence over the people He's placed in our care. So we're going to take a God and others approach to self-discovery and personal growth and unpack the real root cause behind the friction all parents feel in our dynamic with our kids. And we'll do this by examining how our beliefs shape our perception of reality, which, as you'll see, requires some humility to examine the evidence our life is already revealing and what's actually driving our behavior, which is the first step in renewing our thinking with God's truth so that we can start seeing things more clearly. Because when you understand yourself more clearly, then you'll be able to understand your kids much better as well. And then parenting becomes the joy it's intended to be instead of a source of frustration. Because the reality is, renewed minds require more than just good intention. And God Himself has given us the template and tools to grow closer to being the kind of parent He is to us. So let's get into it. In last week's episode, we explored the one relationship that shapes all others. And as I already mentioned, we're going to apply that idea to one of the most important roles many of us will ever have, and that's parenting. The reality is, kids experience our expression of love in a multitude of ways: through our patience, our frustration, the grace we extend to them, and of course, our met and unmet expectations, which usually leads to our praise and criticism. So most parenting conversations you'd find tend to focus on behavior and approach. Things like effective communication, setting boundaries and establishing routines, discipline methods, natural and imposed consequences, both good and bad. And all of those things absolutely matter. But children don't just experience our attempt at executing our parenting techniques. They experience us as people. And like I mentioned earlier, they experience the energy and the emotional environments we create with every interaction. And we all know that our energy is affected by lots of variables, like how we slept last night, if we're dealing with low blood sugar because maybe we're running on 2 macro bars and now it's the witching hour, so everyone else is hungry and cranky too. Our energy is affected by every form of stress. And let's not forget our hormones. Oh, the hormones. And guys, don't roll your eyes. You have them too. But that's not what we're going to cover today, so don't worry. But suffice it to say, we're all dealing with the same variables that our kids are affected by, because we're all human. And while we have very little control over the fluctuations in those variables, especially those pesky hormones, our perception is always present, like 100% of the time. And it's what's dictating the relationships we have with ourselves, which stem from the assumptions we unconsciously operate from, which influences the way we respond to mistakes and how we handle frustration, which is actually rooted in the way we view and treat ourselves. And that raises an important question. What are our children experiencing and absorbing from the way we relate to ourselves? Because if I'm constantly critical of myself, I will unintentionally become critical of my children. If I struggle to extend grace to myself, I'll likely struggle to extend grace to them. And if I believe my self-worth comes from achievement, then it's highly likely that I'll evaluate them through their achievements as well. If I never feel good enough, I may unknowingly communicate that they aren't either. Not because I'm trying to, but because projection is an unconscious expression we have with others. And the projection is rooted in our distorted perception of ourselves, which becomes the lens through which we interpret others, including our children. And if you haven't already, this is the point where people tend to freak out. So if you're hearing all this and thinking, great, now I'm messing up my kids, just take a deep breath and stick with me, because no, that's not where we're going with this. The point isn't condemnation or throwing our hands up in defeat. The point is awareness, self-awareness. And you're in good company, because every parent has distorted perceptions, and every parent has blind spots, and every parent is imperfect, because we're all people who are just doing our best and working with what we've got. And don't worry, there are proven ways to address all this. And the fact that you've hung with me this long proves that you care about how you're showing up for your kids. Maybe even more so than how you show up for yourself, which is key here. Because before we can get into correcting our distorted perceptions, we need to understand where they come from in the first place. I mean, it's not like any of us wake up one morning and decide to interpret ourselves inaccurately. Our understanding of ourselves develops over time and is shaped by two primary factors. One is the standards we use to evaluate ourselves, which is what drives our perceptions. And two, the actual priorities that are driving our decisions and behavior, which often conflict with the standards we're evaluating ourselves by, hence the tension. So we'll start with the standards we use to evaluate ourselves. Every one of us inherits standards. They come from all kinds of places, like our family and upbringing, the culture we grow up in, our religious beliefs and encounters with other believers, school, of course, our peers in every environment, and then some of us, like me, set our own just to keep things extra interesting. And the thing is, some of those standards are actually healthy. I mean, I'll submit that God's standards are the only shoulds we should aspire to live up to. But the nuance here is how we interpret those standards and thus how we live them out, because that's where it gets tricky. When you combine the fact that some of the inherited standards we have aren't actually healthy with the fact that many people never consciously examine them, the result is we simply absorb them, and then we spend our entire lives measuring ourselves against them, which often really results in an ongoing conflict with the second factor, which is the real and highly individualistic priorities that are already driving our behavior. This is the other part most people miss, because we weren't given the tools to examine them properly. You see, even if two people inherit the exact same standards, they won't interpret themselves the same way. Why? Because no two people on the planet prioritize the same things in the same order to the same degree. Everyone is driven by different priorities. We all have different motivations, different needs, different sources of meaning. We have unique gifts and individual callings. And those priorities are the real indicator of what we truly value as individuals. But there's often a disconnect between what people think they prioritize and where they actually spend their time, which, spoiler alert, is the evidence of what you actually prioritize versus what you intend to. And that's where the friction festers in our life. But while the thought of friction can create negative vibes, it's actually incredibly helpful because it's part of the evidence that helps us get to the root cause of what's going on. We evaluate ourselves against inherited standards that might not actually align with what God defined. And we think we're prioritizing one thing, but then our calendar reflects something else. And this is why people spend so many years feeling like they're inconsistent or lazy, like they're unmotivated. Then they feel guilty about it and frustrated. When in reality, the real issue is they're misinterpreting themselves because we're measuring ourselves against the wrong criteria. And we're stuck in a never ending cycle of self judgment when we do that, which doesn't exactly set the stage for a healthy relationship with ourselves. And honestly, it's just unnecessary. So now that we know we're all human and we all have some level of distorted perception, and now we know where it comes from, let's look at how that plays out in our role as a parent or a caregiver of another soul. So dig, if you will, a picture of a parent who deeply values connection as hers or her highest priority. But this parent also believes that being a good parent, and I'm using my air quotes here, should always be productive and efficient and in control of everything. Well, the top priority and those beliefs aren't the same. And now they're constantly judging themselves through a standard that conflicts with what naturally matters most to them. And that's the tension that creates enormous frustration, especially if the connection priority hasn't been identified. So they don't even know what the root of the tension is. And now they feel like they're failing because they're evaluating themselves through that distorted lens. And here's what I mean by distortion, because people can get hung up on this. A distortion isn't simply being wrong. It's an interpretation issue that causes us to perceive ourselves, others, or even God inaccurately. And once that interpretation is internalized, or worse, moralized, we stop seeing it as an interpretation, and instead we see it as reality, and sometimes even as a responsibility. That's why distortions can feel so convincing, and that's why they're often so difficult to identify on our own. But the danger isn't in having distortions. We all have them, remember? The real danger is refusing to examine and acknowledge them, and even worse, defending them. Because distortions we moralize become distortions we protect, and distortions we protect become distortions we pass on. And I think it's safe to say that that's not what any of us are going for. What we're really trying to do is meet our children's needs, and we want to do that well. And what children need is clarity from the people leading them in life. The kind of clarity that's only found through the standards God actually did set for us. Standards like honest humility, the willingness to seek correction and focus on repairing what's broken, and then the growth that results from that. Children benefit from seeing adults who are willing to learn right in front of them and alongside them. Parents who are willing to apologize when necessary and who are willing to reconsider their perspective. You know, the whole slow to speak idea. We need to be willing to admit, I may have interpreted that incorrectly. That's what healthy self awareness looks like. And it's the opposite of perfectionism. It's actually truthfulness. And I think this is why Jesus spoke so often about becoming like children. Not because children are innocent, certainly not because they're always right, but because children are generally teachable. They're curious and open, as long as they aren't chastised for it. And they're generally willing to admit what they don't know. And if you contrast that disposition with the Pharisees, who spent their entire lives studying scripture, waiting for the Messiah, and teaching others about God, yet when God himself stood right in front of them, most of them couldn't recognize him. And it wasn't because they lacked information, it's because their perception had become rigid. They had become so attached to who they expected God to be, what they expected him to do, and how they expected him to act. And those expectations became so strong that they couldn't see reality when it arrived. The problem obviously wasn't God. The problem was the lens through which they were interpreting him. And if we're honest, we're capable of doing the exact same thing, not just with God, but with anyone, including our children and ourselves. The more attached we become to our interpretations, the harder it becomes to see anything clearly. That's why humility matters so much, because humility keeps us teachable, and teachability keeps correction possible. So, in an effort not to approach our parenting like rigid Pharisees, let's look at a few real life scenarios that demonstrate the spectrum of reactions we tend to have to some common parenting challenges. So, scenario one, the broken glass. A child drops a glass, the event is neutral, but the parent's interpretation isn't. One parent sees, oh, accidents happen. Another one sees, why are they always so careless? Another one sees, now I have more work to do. And still another sees, oh my God, I can't believe I just yelled about a glass. The child's behavior isn't the only variable here. The parent's perception is. Once you know this, then you can ask, if I had dropped that glass myself, how would I have spoken to myself? Because that's often the exact tone that comes out towards the child. Scenario two, the poor grade. Some parents see it as, this is information. Others think, this reflects their potential. And others think, this reflects me. That last one is where it gets interesting, because now we're talking about identity. And I'm not talking about theirs. Now we're talking about how entangled our identities are with our children's performance against our expectations based on our association with how our worth is tied to achievement. And suddenly, a math grade isn't about math anymore. It's about tying our perception of worth to test scores and projecting that distortion onto the child that we value more than math. Scenario three, emotional meltdowns. A child has a meltdown and the parent becomes emotionally activated. Why? Because many parents aren't responding to the child's emotion, they're responding to their own discomfort with emotion. And where did they learn that? Often from the way they relate to themselves. If I don't know how to sit with my own frustration, I'm going to struggle to sit with theirs. If I suppress my own emotions, I'll probably try to suppress theirs. And if I fear conflict, I may overcorrect theirs. Again, the child isn't experiencing a parenting technique in these scenarios. They're experiencing a person who is unknowingly navigating the relationship they have with themselves, and it's being projected onto them. And here's where it gets even deeper, because this matters spiritually as well. Jesus tells us to love others as ourselves, and parenting is one of the clearest places that command becomes visible, because our children experience our definition of love before they understand theology. But as we just explored, the relationship we have with ourselves not only dictates our relationships with others, it becomes a relational inheritance, so to speak, whether we intend it to or not. And that's where it becomes really interesting. Because many Christian parents have heard, honor your father and mother. We've heard that thousands of times. But often with little discussion that pairs that commandment with others, like become like little children, test everything, be transformed by the renewing of your mind, take every thought captive, correct one another, and remove the plank from your own eye. You get the gist. So in a naturally hierarchical parent-child relationship, that honor your father and mother commandment, when taken in isolation, risks becoming a moralized distortion of the parent's perception of their role. And once that happens, questioning it feels sinful. So well-intentioned people unconsciously cling to the thought that good children don't question their parents, instead of God can use anyone to reveal truth, which creates a completely different dynamic than what I believe God intended, because it often results in straining relationships instead of building them up, which is what he clearly prioritizes for us. But when our children think that correction of adults is disrespectful, and it can be, it's all in the delivery, and curiosity is considered rebellion, and disagreement is viewed as dishonorable, those distortions can follow someone for decades. Not because scripture taught them, but because the perception distorted the scripture. The commandment wasn't distorted, the interpretation was. But when we lean into childlike faith, that carries the traits of curiosity, dependency, and teachability, which are the very traits many adults have lost because certainty and control felt safer than humility. But humility is what allows correction, and correction is what allows transformation. So if at this point you're thinking, okay, there might be something to this, maybe I do project my relationship with myself onto my kids, so what do I do about it? Don't start by analyzing your children. You can't control them anyway. Just ask the parent of a screaming, overtired 2-year-old on an airplane. Instead, start with examining the only thing you can control, and that's yourself. Start asking yourself the tough questions like, where am I hardest on myself? And where do I struggle to extend grace? What standards am I using to evaluate myself? And where did they come from? What expectations am I unconsciously projecting onto others? And as you ask yourself those questions, if you discover that you don't understand yourself quite as well as you thought you did, then check out the Core Priorities Snapshot, the link below. It's a free tool I created to extract the lived evidence I talked about earlier, because that's the key to seeing yourself clearly and dismantling those distortions as you identify them. And just remember that the goal isn't to become a perfect parent. The goal is to become a more self-aware human being and a humble servant. And humble servants become parents who create nurturing environments where their child they've been entrusted with can grow into the person God created them to be. And the fastest way to get there is by examining the evidence your life is already revealing so you can start seeing yourself and everyone else more clearly. And when that happens, every relationship improves. And one of the greatest gifts we can give our children is not the appearance of certainty or perfection, but rather modeling what it looks like to remain teachable.